The bright lights of the MSNBC studio illuminated the tense scene unfolding on live television. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat composed in her chair, her emerald green blazer contrasting sharply with the studio's deep blue backdrop. Across from her, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz leaned forward with a dismissive smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," Walz said, his voice carrying a patronizing tone that made the host visibly uncomfortable, "your proposal shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how state budgets actually work. Maybe in Texas they do things differently, but those of us who've actually governed know the real challenges." The studio fell completely silent. The host, Rachel Mitchell, shifted awkwardly in her seat, unsure whether to intervene. For 3 long seconds, Crockett didn't respond. She simply maintained eye contact with Walz, her expression unreadable. Then, without breaking that gaze, she calmly reached into her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Governor," she said, her voice steady and controlled, "I was hoping you might go there." She held up the document, which Walz couldn't yet see. "Because what I have right here might make you reconsider not just your words, but your entire approach to this conversation." What happened next left Governor Walz speechless, the host stunned, and viewers across America reaching for their phones to share what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another political disagreement. It was the moment Jasmine Crockett turned what was meant to be her public humiliation into one of the most powerful displays of political expertise ever captured on live television. Before we dive into the remarkable exchange that followed, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss these pivotal moments when political figures are held accountable in real time for their words. Governor Tim Walz had built his political reputation as a straight-talking Midwesterner with practical solutions. At 60, the former teacher and National Guard veteran had governed Minnesota for 5 years, earning national recognition for his handling of several crises. His folksy demeanor and ability to connect with rural voters had made him a popular figure in Democratic politics, often called upon to explain complex policy to everyday Americans. Tonight, he appeared on MSNBC's special program, American Infrastructure: The Path Forward, to discuss his state's ambitious infrastructure plan and how it could serve as a model for other states. Wearing his characteristic rolled-up shirt sleeves and tie, Walz projected the image of a working governor who had traded theory for practical experience. Seated across from him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 44, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. Before entering Congress, Crockett had established herself as a formidable attorney specializing in civil rights law and, less known to the public, municipal finance. With degrees in business, economics, and law, she had practiced for over 15 years before winning her seat in Congress. What most viewers didn't know was that before law school, Crockett had worked for 3 years as a budget analyst for the city of Houston, focusing on infrastructure funding mechanisms. This experience had given her an unusual perspective for a member of Congress, intimate knowledge of how municipal budgets actually worked at the implementation level. The tension between Walz and Crockett had begun earlier that week. During a Democratic policy conference, Crockett had proposed a modified approach to infrastructure funding that challenged several assumptions in Walz's much-publicized Minnesota model. While her critiques were substantive and data-driven, Walz had dismissed them as theoretical and lacking practical understanding, comments that had been widely reported. For viewers at home, this wasn't just about infrastructure policy. It represented a broader tension in American politics, between those who claim authority through executive experience and those who approach problems through research, analysis, and on-the-ground community impact. It was about who gets taken seriously in policy debates and whose expertise is respected. The host, Rachel Mitchell, a veteran journalist known for her substantive policy discussions, introduced the segment. Tonight we're examining different approaches to infrastructure funding at the state and federal levels. Governor Walz has implemented what's being called the Minnesota model, while Congresswoman Crockett has proposed several modifications to that approach. Governor, let's start with you. Walz had launched into a well-rehearsed explanation of his infrastructure plan, emphasizing its practical success and implementation. We've repaired 327 bridges and created over 15,000 jobs in the process, he noted with pride. This isn't theory. These are real results for real people. When Mitchell turned to Crockett, the Congresswoman had begun by acknowledging the successes in Minnesota before raising several concerns. While the Minnesota model has absolutely delivered results, our analysis suggests it may not be replicable in states with different tax structures and infrastructure needs. I've identified 3 specific modifications that could make this approach more adaptable nationwide. It was at this point that Walz had interrupted with his dismissive comment about Crockett's understanding of state budgets, setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated in your workplace or community because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what an expert looks like? Share your experiences in the comments below. We're particularly interested in hearing how people overcame these assumptions and proved their knowledge against the odds. Governor, Crockett continued, still holding the document she had retrieved from her portfolio, before I address your comment, I'd like to clarify something. Are you suggesting that my concerns about your model's applicability in states with different debt structures and infrastructure profiles demonstrates a lack of understanding about state budgets? Walz, seemingly confident in his position, doubled down. What I'm saying, Congresswoman, is that governing is different from theorizing. In Minnesota, we've implemented a real-world solution that works. The complexities of budget implementation aren't always visible from Washington. Crockett nodded slowly. I appreciate that perspective, Governor. Experience certainly matters. Let me ask you this. Are you familiar with municipal debt capacity formulas and how they vary across states with different constitutional debt limitations? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Walz's face, but he maintained his confident tone. Of course, Minnesota has one of the most stringent debt limitation formulas in the country, which is why our infrastructure model is particularly impressive. And would you agree that those limitations make your model difficult to implement in states like Texas, Florida, or Pennsylvania, which have entirely different constitutional debt provisions? I would say those differences can be navigated with the right leadership, Walz replied, his answer becoming more general. Crockett nodded again. One more question before I share this document. Are you familiar with the Houston Metro Transit Funding Mechanism of 2012, which I helped design? Walz's expression changed slightly. I can't say that I am, no. I understand. It's not widely known outside municipal finance circles, Crockett said, her tone remaining respectful rather than triumphant. That's actually my point here, Governor. Not all expertise is immediately visible or recognized. She then turned the document in her hand so the camera could capture it. This is my resume from before I entered Congress. I spent 3 years as a senior budget analyst for the city of Houston, specializing in infrastructure financing. I then spent 7 years in private practice representing municipalities in bond issuances for infrastructure projects across 5 states. The host leaned forward with interest. Congresswoman Crockett, I wasn't aware of your background in municipal finance. Most people aren't, Crockett acknowledged. It's not as visible as my civil rights work or my time in Congress. But I've personally structured over $2 billion in municipal bonds for infrastructure projects, many in communities similar to those in Minnesota. She pulled out a second document. This is the comparative analysis my office prepared on the Minnesota model. We examined its application across states with different debt structures, tax bases, and infrastructure needs. The concerns I raised aren't theoretical. They're based on concrete financial, a modeling showing where the approach would face constitutional and fiscal barriers in other states. Walz's expression had shifted from dismissive to attentive, though he still projected confidence. I'd be interested to see that analysis, Congresswoman. But the results in Minnesota speak for themselves. They absolutely do, Crockett agreed. The Minnesota model has been remarkably successful in Minnesota. My point is simply that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't acknowledge the vast differences in state financing structures. She produced a third document. This chart shows the debt capacity analysis for implementing your model in Texas. The green areas indicate where it works perfectly. The yellow shows where modifications would be needed. And the red highlights constitutional barriers that would prevent direct implementation. Mitchell, the host, examined the document with interest. "This is quite detailed, Congresswoman. Governor Walz, what's your response to this analysis?" Walz, now realizing he had underestimated Crockett's expertise, shifted his approach. "I appreciate the Congresswoman's thorough analysis. I'd need time to review it in detail, but I've always maintained that states would need to adapt our approach to their specific circumstances." "That's precisely my point, Governor," Crockett responded. "The adaptations are what I've been trying to discuss. They're not criticisms of your success in Minnesota, but rather pathways to replicate that success elsewhere." The tension in the studio remained high, but the dynamic had shifted. What had begun as an attempt to dismiss Crockett had transformed into a substantive policy discussion where her expertise could no longer be questioned. Sensing this change, Walz attempted to regain footing by focusing on his executive experience. "Analysis is important, Congresswoman, but there's no substitute for having actually implemented these policies and dealt with the inevitable challenges that arise." Crockett nodded. "I couldn't agree more, Governor. Implementation experience is invaluable. That's why I'd like to share one more thing." She retrieved a final document from her portfolio. "These are 5 infrastructure projects I personally structured the financing for and oversaw to completion while working with municipalities." She handed the document to both Walz and the host, including the North Houston Transit Corridor project, which overcame 3 constitutional challenges and required a special financing vehicle that I designed. It was later used as a model in 7 other states. Mitchell looked at the document with surprise. "This is impressive, Congresswoman. These are major projects." "Thank you," Crockett replied. "My point isn't to boast about my experience, Governor. It's to highlight that expertise comes in many forms. When you suggested I don't understand how state budgets actually work, you were making an assumption based on incomplete information." Walz, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to backtrack. "I certainly didn't mean to suggest you lack expertise, Congresswoman. I was simply emphasizing the importance of executive experience." "Which is valuable," Crockett acknowledged. "Just as hands-on experience structuring and implementing the very financing mechanisms we're discussing is valuable. The most productive conversations happen when we recognize different types of expertise rather than dismissing perspectives that don't match our assumptions." The studio had grown completely quiet. The confrontation had transformed from a dismissive exchange into a masterclass on both policy substance and professional respect. The dynamic in the studio had fundamentally shifted. Governor Walz, who had entered the segment projecting casual authority, now sat reviewing Crockett's infrastructure financing documents with newfound attentiveness. The dismissive smirk had vanished, replaced by the focused expression of someone reassessing their position. Mitchell, sensing the powerful television moment unfolding, directed the conversation towards substance. "Governor Walz, having seen Congresswoman Crockett's background and analysis, would you approach your infrastructure model differently if implementing it nationwide?" Walz took a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. "I think the Congresswoman raises valid points about the need for flexibility across different state systems. Her analysis of the constitutional barriers in states like Texas is quite thorough." He glanced again at Crockett's documents. "I'm particularly interested in this alternative bond structure she's proposing for high-growth states. That could address some of the limitations we encountered even in Minnesota." It was a significant concession from a governor who moments earlier had questioned Crockett's basic understanding of budget principles. Crockett nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Governor. And I want to emphasize that Minnesota's approach has been groundbreaking. My suggestions are built on your foundation, not replacing it." Mitchell turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, you mentioned 3 specific modifications to make the Minnesota model more adaptable nationwide. Could you elaborate on those?" "Absolutely," Crockett replied, now free to discuss the substance of her ideas rather than defending her credentials. As she outlined her proposed modifications, she referenced specific elements of Walz's program with technical precision that further established her command of the subject. The first modification addresses states with constitutional debt ceilings below 10% of assessed property value. In these cases, we'd need to implement what we call a stepped financing mechanism that phases infrastructure investment through special purpose vehicles rather than direct state borrowing. She turned to Walz directly. "Governor, this approach actually builds on the innovative work you did with Minnesota's Transportation Trust Fund, but adapts it for states with stricter debt limitations." Walz, now engaged with the substance rather than the status competition, leaned forward with genuine interest. "That's an interesting adaptation. We considered something similar, but found it unnecessary given Minnesota's specific debt provisions." "Exactly," Crockett agreed. "That's the kind of state-specific modification that acknowledges both the strengths of your model and the diverse fiscal realities across states." As Crockett outlined her second and third proposed modifications, the conversation transformed into exactly what political discourse should be: a substantive exchange of ideas between informed parties working toward common goals. The victory wasn't that Crockett had embarrassed Walz. It was that she had transformed what began as a dismissive interaction into a productive policy discussion by calmly establishing her expertise through undeniable evidence rather than defensive assertions. Mitchell, recognizing the remarkable shift in the conversation, addressed it directly. "Governor Walz, earlier you suggested that Congresswoman Crockett might not fully understand state budget operations. Having heard her expertise in analysis, has your perspective changed?" The studio fell silent. This was the moment of truth. Would Walz acknowledge his misjudgment or double down? After a brief pause, Walz nodded. "I clearly underestimated the Congresswoman's background in this area. Her experience structuring municipal finance is impressive, and her analysis of our Minnesota model is more detailed than most I've seen." He turned to face Crockett directly. "Congresswoman, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your expertise that were clearly unfounded. Sometimes those of us who have served as governors can fall into the trap of thinking executive experience is the only relevant perspective." The sincerity in his voice was evident, and it transformed what could have been merely a moment of vindication into something more meaningful. A public acknowledgement that expertise comes in many forms and shouldn't be assumed based on titles or appearances. Crockett's response was gracious. "I appreciate that, Governor, and I want to emphasize that your executive experience provides insights that my background doesn't. That's precisely why these conversations are so valuable. They bring different forms of expertise together to create more comprehensive solutions." The host, recognizing the powerful moment unfolding, allowed it to breathe rather than rushing to the next question. Viewers at home witnessed something rare in modern political discourse: a genuine exchange of respect between public figures who had moved beyond posturing to substance. The impact of the exchange between Congresswoman Crockett and Governor Walz reverberated far beyond the MSNBC studio. As the segment concluded and the cameras stopped rolling, the studio remained energized. Staff members whispered among themselves, and several approached Crockett to express their admiration. In the green room afterward, Walz approached Crockett away from the cameras. "Congresswoman," he said, extending his hand, "I'd like to continue this conversation beyond tonight's show. Your financing model for high-growth states could address some challenges we're seeing in our regional infrastructure coalition." Crockett accepted both his handshake and the olive branch it represented. "I'd welcome that, Governor. My office can send over our complete analysis. Perhaps we could schedule a more in-depth discussion next week." "I'd like that," Walz replied. "My team will reach out to yours tomorrow." What viewers didn't see was this moment of genuine professional connection, the real aftermath of what could have been just another contentious political exchange. By the time they left the studio, the first clips had already hit social media. Within an hour, the segment had gone viral, but not in the way political confrontations typically do. Rather than focusing solely on the gotcha moment, many of the most widely shared clips included both Crockett's evidence-based response and Walz's subsequent acknowledgement and apology. Watch how Congresswoman Crockett turns dismissal into dialogue, read one viral tweet that had accumulated over 50,000 shares by midnight. Another popular clip highlighted Walz's apology with the caption, "More of this in politics, please." The morning shows across networks picked up the story, but with a different angle than the usual political conflict narrative. On CBS Mornings, host Gayle King observed, "What made this exchange remarkable wasn't just Congresswoman Crockett proving her expertise. It's that both she and Governor Walz ultimately modeled how political discourse should work, moving from assumption to evidence to collaboration." On CNN, political analyst David Axelrod noted, "In my decades in politics, I've rarely seen a moment where substance so completely triumphed over status. Crockett could have gone for the jugular after being dismissed, but instead, she elevated the entire conversation. And credit to Walz for having the character to acknowledge his error rather than doubling down." By afternoon, the Washington Post had published an analysis piece titled, "The Politics of Expertise: What Walz-Crockett Exchange Reveals About Who We Listen To." The article examined how certain credentials and backgrounds are automatically granted authority in policy discussions, while others, particularly those held by women of color, must be repeatedly proven. The piece quoted several female elected officials who described similar experiences of having their expertise questioned or dismissed. The New York Times editorial board weighed in with a piece called "Beyond the Clapback: When Political Discourse Actually Works," which praised both Crockett's approach and Walz's willingness to acknowledge his error. For Crockett, the aftermath brought not just media attention, but substantive policy engagement. Within days, her office had received formal requests for her infrastructure financing analysis from 12 state governments and the National Governors Association. 3 congressional committees requested her testimony on municipal finance innovations. Most significantly, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, which had previously passed over Crockett for a leadership position on a key subcommittee, announced she would co-chair a special task force on innovative infrastructure financing. The announcement pointedly noted her extensive background in municipal finance and proven expertise in developing adaptable infrastructure funding mechanisms. When asked about this reversal at a press conference, the committee chair was refreshingly candid. Sometimes expertise isn't immediately visible or recognized. Congresswoman Crockett's knowledge in this area is precisely what our committee needs as we develop funding approaches that work across diverse state systems. Progressive advocacy groups highlighted the exchange as an example of how qualified women of color often must overprove their expertise to be taken seriously. What's remarkable isn't that Congresswoman Crockett is qualified, noted one viral social media post. It's that she had to come armed with her entire resume to be heard. How many other voices are we missing because they don't get the chance to present their receipts on national television? Conservative commentators, meanwhile, focused on Walz's handling of the situation. While some criticized him for backing down, others praised his willingness to acknowledge a mistake. On Fox News, commentator Dana Perino remarked, "Governor Walz showed leadership by acknowledging he had underestimated Congresswoman Crockett's expertise. That kind of humility is something we could use more of on both sides of the aisle." For Walz himself, the incident became a moment of reflection rather than embarrassment. Rather than trying to minimize the exchange, he addressed it directly in an interview with the Minnesota Star-Tribune the following week. "That conversation taught me something important," he acknowledged. "As a governor, I'm used to being the authority on state operations. But Congresswoman Crockett reminded me that expertise comes in many forms, and assumptions about who possesses it can prevent us from finding the best solutions." He went further, announcing a new approach to his Infrastructure Advisory Council, expanding it to include not just executives and traditional experts, but also those with diverse implementation experience across different financing systems. "We're specifically seeking people with hands-on municipal finance experience and those who've worked within different state constitutional frameworks," Walz explained. The Minnesota model itself evolved in response to the exchange. Within a month, Walz's office released what they called Minnesota 2.0, an adapted version of their infrastructure approach that incorporated several of Crockett's proposed modifications to make it more adaptable across different state systems. These adaptations address constitutional barriers we hadn't fully considered in our original model, Walz explained at the press conference announcing the update. Congresswoman Crockett's analysis identified specific challenges our approach would face in states with different debt structures, and we've incorporated her solutions. Professional organizations took note as well. The American Society of Civil Engineers featured both Crockett and Walz at their annual conference, highlighting their collaboration as an example of bipartisan progress on infrastructure funding. The Municipal Finance Officers Association created a new certification program based partly on Crockett's adaptable financing models. University public policy programs began using the exchange as a teaching tool. At Georgetown's School of Public Policy, Professor James Harrison incorporated the full segment into his course on effective policy communication. This exchange demonstrates several critical lessons, he told his students: how to establish expertise without being defensive, how to acknowledge an error gracefully, and how substantive policy discussion can emerge from what could have been just another political confrontation. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome emerged 6 months after the exchange, when Walz and Crockett announced a joint initiative called Adaptive Infrastructure America. The program combined elements of Walz's Minnesota model with Crockett's modifications, creating a flexible framework that states could adapt to their specific constitutional and fiscal environments. At the press conference announcing the initiative, a reporter asked how this unlikely partnership had formed. "It started with a moment of tension on live television," Walz acknowledged with a smile, "but it evolved into something much more valuable because Congresswoman Crockett responded not with anger, but with evidence." Crockett nodded in agreement. "And because Governor Walz was willing to look at that evidence with an open mind, rather than doubling down on assumptions." Their joint presentation began with both acknowledging the journey to their collaboration. "Some of you may have seen the moment when Congresswoman Crockett schooled me on municipal finance," Walz said with a self-deprecating smile. "What you didn't see was how that moment led to a partnership that has strengthened both of our approaches." Crockett built on his point. "The best policy solutions come when we move beyond assumptions about who has expertise and focus, instead on bringing different forms of knowledge together." As they outlined their comprehensive infrastructure framework, attendees witnessed something increasingly rare in American politics: two leaders who had moved past a potential moment of division to create something more valuable through collaboration. CNN's Jake Tapper, covering the announcement, observed, "In Washington's current climate, we expect political confrontations to end with both parties retreating to their corners. Crockett and Walz have shown a different path forward, using a moment of tension as a catalyst for substantive collaboration." For everyday Americans watching these developments, the lesson extended beyond infrastructure policy. It demonstrated the power of standing your ground with evidence rather than emotion, of establishing expertise through substance rather than assertion, and of transforming what could have been merely a clapback into a constructive path forward. In professional development seminars across the country, the exchange became known as an example of the Crockett method, responding to dismissal not with equal dismissal, but with such undeniable evidence of expertise that the only path forward is substantive engagement with ideas. 1 year after the original exchange, a documentary filmmaker interviewed both Crockett and Walz about its impact. "Did you know in that moment that your response would change not just the conversation, but lead to actual policy collaboration?" The filmmaker asked Crockett. She smiled thoughtfully. "I wasn't thinking that far ahead. I was simply determined to establish my right to be part of the conversation based on my actual expertise rather than assumptions about what I know or don't know." When asked what he had learned, Walz's response was equally reflective. "I learned that sometimes the most valuable voices in a conversation are the ones we too quickly dismiss, and that being willing to acknowledge when you're wrong isn't a weakness. It's how we arrive at better solutions." The documentary, titled Beyond the Clapback: How Evidence Changed the Conversation, highlighted not just the exchange itself, but the substantive policy developments that followed. Tangible infrastructure improvements in 17 states using the adaptive financing models Crockett and Walz had developed together. In political science classrooms, communications courses, and leadership seminars, the Walz-Crockett exchange became a case study in how political discourse could work at its best, moving beyond assumptions and personal attacks to evidence-based collaboration that actually solves problems. And for millions of Americans who witnessed both the original exchange and its constructive aftermath, it provided something increasingly rare in modern politics: hope that substantive dialogue based on evidence rather than assumption could actually lead to better governance and real solutions to the challenges facing communities across the nation. If you found this analysis of the Walz-Crockett exchange valuable, Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth breakdowns of pivotal political moments. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss our uploads. We believe politics is about more than just conflict and gotcha moments. It's about the substance of governance and how leaders actually solve problems. Share this video with someone who appreciates thoughtful political analysis, and let us know in the comments. What other political exchanges would you like us to analyze in future videos? What moments have you witnessed where substance triumphed over assumptions in professional settings?